Hello everyone and welcome to this keynote session. I am Oancea. I'm Professor of Philosophy of Education and Research Policy at the University of Oxford, a member of the Research Management Committee of CGHE, and I also lead the Research on Research project of the Centre. This session will take about 50 minutes, including a talk for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then some time for discussion. I invite you to post your questions in the chat throughout the talk. And I will look at the chat to invite as many people as possible to ask their questions live at the end of the session, time permitting. But we'll continue the conversation after the 50 minutes and in a breakout room where you can join Chris and CGHE colleagues. And the link will be available in the chat at the end of this session and also is on the main conference platform. It is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Chris Millward. Chris is the Director for Fair Access and Participation at the Office for Students. And for our international audience, the Office for Students is the independent public body with regulatory responsibility for higher education in England. Chris is an executive member of the Office for Students board, and his role is to ensure that universities and colleges are doing all they can to support underrepresented groups to access and succeed in higher education. He's also responsible for the Teaching Excellence and Student Outcomes Framework, also known as TEF, the National Exercise for Assessing Excellence in Teaching at the Universities and Colleges of England, also for health policy and student welfare and safeguarding. His talk today will explore the notion of fair access to university and focus on how, over the past 2 decades, governments in England have positioned access to higher education within meritocratic policies, aiming to improve equality of opportunity. Chris, welcome. The screen is yours.
Okay, thanks, Alice, and hi, everyone. I hope you're all well, wherever you are. As is always the way with these things, I'm going to try start sharing my screen now because I'm going to show you a few slides. Hopefully you can see that. Perhaps nod, Alice, if you can see that. If that's the case, I'll get started. So as Alice said already, I've worked in English higher education for 25 years. I worked in universities, a research council, and for a decade prior to this, I worked for the Higher Education Funding Council for England, which was the predecessor to the Office for Students, who I work for now. I'm the Director for Fair Access and Participation, which is a statutory role, and it's been in place since 2017, but there were previous people in post, as I'll talk about, called the Director for Fair Access, who had a similar role. I'm going to talk in this session about how policy and practice relating to widening participation and fair access, and that's the goal on the one hand to increase the number of people entering higher education, but also on the other make all universities, including the most selective, more representative of the wider population. So how policies pursuing that goal developed during this period over 20 years or so, the extent to which they succeeded, and indeed where they're going next. I've labelled this a story in 4 parts, and there's a kind of linear element to that, but there is also a kind of plot element to that as well. The reason I've labelled it in 4 parts is because it reflects the changing pattern of funding and regulation during the period, punctuated by independent reviews, by white papers and by legislation. So the first part of that, in the first part of the century, was widening participation pursued through government grant and a small student contribution financing an increase in places. And then that was given significant momentum by the then Prime Minister's commitment to increase to reach a 50% higher education participation rate. In the second, there was an increase in the contribution made by graduates to the cost of expansion from 2006, albeit through income contingent loans, together with a much more activist approach to reaching underrepresented people and places, and a fair access regulator to avoid them being disadvantaged. In the third part, following the global banking crash, and a change of government, there was more radical cost sharing with graduates from 2012, together with the strengthening of measures to support the most disadvantaged students and to empower student choice and demand. Then in the fourth, legislation in 2017 to establish the regulatory architecture for a student-led system, shifting from a funding body model of oversight to a regulated register of providers with an access and participation plan as the first condition of registration. And now, particularly today, actually, as the Queen's speech goes through Parliament, we're heading into a fifth part where there is a potential shift in the consensus that has governed policy towards increasing participation in higher education during the century to date, with a focus on levelling up the opportunities for people who don't go into higher education. There's also in this the features that I think you should find in any good story. So firstly, the setting, which is the English higher education system, fixed in the minds of the nation and the world around ancient collegiate universities, which still channel much of our elite, particularly our politicians and our national media. And despite expansion and diversification, to the extent that more than half of current graduates have now studied and worked where they grew up, university is still widely perceived as being residential, academic and elite in England. Indeed, that's all part of its global appeal. English higher education is also highly stratified, with the most prestigious and research-intensive universities, which lead to the most highly paid and prestigious jobs, recruiting the lowest proportions of disadvantaged students. And that's reflecting a particularly strong relationship between social background and school grades and university admissions. What one researcher called to me when I first started in this job, an efficient sorting system. There's also a strong element of character in this story. So politicians, vice-chancellors, students' unions and review bodies have all shaped the debate around the changes I'm describing. The most important characters for me, though, are students and their families, who have increasingly aspired to go to university and get a degree, despite the increasing cost to them over time. And of course, in the case of the most prosperous families and schools, have done all they can to sustain their hold over the most selective universities and courses, private schooling and tutoring, houses in the right catchment areas, all successful weapons in what you might call the educational arms race, as indeed our experience of lockdown and the closure of schools to students has proved. Alongside this, and perhaps more crucially than ever, the other key characters are people who haven't been to university, who have increasingly exercised their power and influence through the ballot box. The third element is conflict. So of course there was conflict between students and government about fee levels, but also I would argue between the identity and the value of graduates, the identity and values of graduates and non-graduates, and indeed the places where they are most found and where they tend to live. The fourth element is the plot. So the plot for me is the pursuit of increasing higher education participation in the belief that it would create a more fair and open society, an education-based meritocracy enabling social mobility and thereby life chances to be determined by ability rather than background. But alongside that, and the fifth element, the theme. And my theme is that in liberal societies like England, within which there is choice for students and families within the education system, higher education expansion will not reduce inequality and perceptions of fairness on its own. Other measures are needed to equalise opportunities, and that applies within higher education, but also beyond it, bridging the divisions between higher and further education, academic and vocational education, graduates and the wider population, and the places where they tend to live. I'm just going to pause there, Alice, because I'm not sure my screen is moving forward. So I wondered if I need to.
Moving, yes.
No, yeah. So I'm going to stop sharing and try again and see if this works, and hopefully keep talking whilst I do that. There we go. So that's what I just told you.
Perfect.
Okay. So, and just to share this with you, this is a good example of the stratification of the English system. So there are two charts I'm going to show you here, and each bar on these charts is a university, and they're split according to the entry tariff points. And broadly, the red ones and the pink ones are further education colleges and the lowest entry tariff universities. And the yellow ones are the highest tariff universities. And what you can see is that there are by far higher proportions of students from the most underrepresented groups in the further education colleges and lower tariff universities, and very few still in the highest tariff universities. If I then switch that analysis to earnings, so this is earnings 3 years after qualifying from a degree course, of course you can see exactly the opposite effect. So the high tariff universities in yellow yield much higher graduate earnings than further education colleges and low tariff universities in pink. So we have a very stratified system driven by the relationship between social background, entry grades, and the university to which you go to, and what that then yields in terms of your life prospects. So I'm going to go back to part one now and just talk a bit more about how this started. And this is quite a famous quote from the then Prime Minister in 2001, Tony Blair. At the start of the century, we have a relatively new government aiming to widen participation by increasing places in higher education. And that progressive policy, though, accompanied by a step that previous governments, including Margaret Thatcher, had avoided, which was a relatively small £1,000 upfront contribution from students towards the cost of their studies. That was given real momentum by this commitment, the commitment to a 50% participation rate among young people. And I think it's worth reflecting on how that is framed. So it would be genuinely based on merit, strictly meritocratic, and there would be no lowering of entry standards. I think few in this audience, given what you're interested in, are likely to disagree with the ambition to increase and indeed widen higher education participation. But the language here does raise some questions. So, for example, whether entry standards are synonymous with merit, and whether increasing higher education participation on this basis will indeed yield a society based on merit, within which your background does not hold you back. Also, what would be the consequences of such a society for those who don't meet the entry standard, who aren't able or indeed don't want to capitalise on equality of opportunity and social mobility through higher education, which of course in this vision would be half of the young population, let alone the existing adult population. And regardless of the entry standard, what about the exit standard and how to pay for it? The government puts flesh on this aspiration in a white paper 3 years later, 2004 white paper on the future of higher education. And it's interesting again to reflect on how this was going to be achieved. It's not through full-time degree level study in universities, but a lot of pathways through further education colleges, flexible and part-time learning, shorter foundation degrees designed with employers. There would be increasing tuition fees up to £3,000, but not upfront, and supported by maintenance grants. And there would, for the first time, be an access regulator who would agree plans to support the poorest students. That last measure is crucial to getting the fee through Parliament at the time, given the assumption that the poorest students would be put off by the higher fee, particularly in the most selective universities and courses. And it is an important step with lasting consequences, but it doesn't, in my view, encroach substantially on universities. It focuses on bursaries rather than admissions, and access rather than the quality and the experience on course. The new Director for Fair Access, who is a recent Vice-Chancellor, is charged, as I am now, to protect academic freedom in relation to admissions. So the pursuit of fairness in the job title has some constraints. A sector-level review of admissions, shown here on the right-hand side, also led by a Vice-Chancellor, proposes fairly cautious consideration of the context in which grades have been achieved, and indeed, as you can see here, only in borderline cases. So merit for the most part here means entry grades. Some of the most interesting work at this time involves reshaping higher education and taking it to new places. So new universities in rural counties like Suffolk and Cornwall and Cumbria, and higher education centres in post-industrial and coastal towns like Burnley and Grimsby and Southend. A lot of this is underpinned by collaboration between universities and further education colleges, and there are lifelong learning networks that agree pathways between courses at quite a detailed level. There's also at this time some quite interesting discussion about regional coherence and different missions in places like the northeast of England and the east of England, with a view potentially to breaking the link between geographical and social mobility. But more radical change and more of this would have required, I think, stronger funding incentives and or less autonomy for universities. And all of that is overtaken by events. Following the banking crash in 2008, there's a short period of activism to combat recession, with higher education moving to a new business ministry and increased investment in graduate training and graduate jobs. But the establishment of a review panel led by an industrialist, John Brown, signals a further rebalancing of the contributions made by graduates and the state. As the review title shown here suggests, the review is really focused on the sustainability of higher education, and a new coalition government with a mission to cut the national deficit switches the £3 billion from teaching grant into loans to students repayable over time, but crucially covering up to tripling of tuition fees. That enables continued expansion. It sustains the investment in higher education, whilst most other parts of the education system and the public sphere experience cuts. Facing backlash from students, which is seen around Parliament, the government's white paper, also shown here, Students at the Heart of the System, tries to put students at the forefront with better information and indeed new providers who are labelled as the tide that lifts all boats, enabling student choices and student needs to drive provision. Government also increases the size, if not the powers, of the access regulator, and this is a new regulator controversially recruited from outside the research-led universities, and it expects a proportionate increase in spending in this area to accompany the increase in fees. And notwithstanding this, I think there's evidence by this time that although bursaries and scholarships improve the experiences of the poorest students, reducing their need to work alongside their studies, for example, they have little effect on the patterns of demand and thereby access to higher education. Neither students nor universities spend much time considering differential fees, because the real cost to the student is their immediate living expenses and the repayment of their loans as a proportion of their salary over time. Admissions continue to lie beyond the powers of the access regulator, and there is still a strong correlation between social background, school attainment, and whether or where you go into higher education. So with access spending needed to increase, policy and practice shifts significantly towards university outreach, equipping students with the understanding, the appetite, and it is hoped the grades needed to succeed. I'm just going to pause now to look at what those policies actually led to in terms of patterns of participation. And I think the first point to note was there a lot of money spent on this. So what you can see here, this is the grant to universities from government for widening participation and fair access. And that has pretty much been sustained over nearly 15 years at the level of around £400 million. Alongside that, shown here, there's been a really substantial increase in university spending on widening participation and fair access, initially as bursaries, shown on the yellow line here, and then increasingly, as I've talked about, on outreach, shown in the blue line, but steepling over time as fees have increased. What's that achieved? Well, it certainly has achieved the desired increase in overall levels of participation. So this shows you young entrants into higher education. It shows a bit of a dip in 2012 when the year before tried to avoid the new fee, but broadly a continued increase, and crucially also an increase in the yellow line here, which is the highest tariff providers, the most selective providers that government really wanted to expand choice. Important to note, though, that that increase happens across all groups of students. So actually the gap between the most and least represented groups, whether it's considered in terms of the neighbourhood they come from, the parts of the country they come from, which is shown on the left-hand side, or a kind of income-based measure like eligibility for free school meals, which is shown on the right-hand side, that gap increases little. So this is the overall numbers for the whole sector. And of course, the gap in the highest tariff providers is much higher. So particularly strong levels of participation from the most highly represented group shown in the blue line on the left-hand side. Also for students who aren't on free school meals. So although overall participation is increasing, actually you could argue that equality isn't particularly either overall or in the highest tariff universities. If we look at the present day and we combine those measures, so we look at the neighbourhood students come from, we look at measures like free school meal, we look at other factors like gender and ethnicity, we can see a very high concentration of certain types of students in the least represented group. So 90% of students shown at the bottom here who are either from the lowest participation neighbourhoods, and we know that they are mostly post-industrial towns and parts of cities and coastal towns. 90% of students are either from those places or on free school meals. So these are people who, for the most part, have benefited very little from the expansion of higher education and indeed the increasing flow of graduates into the workforce. The figures I've presented are all about young entry, but an important trend also to highlight during this period is what happened to older learners, in part because of the way the funding system worked, in part because of levels of demand among those learners in this system. And what you can see here, shown in the blue and turquoise lines below, is a very significant decline in mature student participation, and specifically part-time mature student participation. If you also look at the types of courses that are being followed, you can see a very strong link between that declining line for mature part-time students and what we tend to call the other undergraduate population. So these are shorter cycle courses below a full degree. This kind of study has diminished, whereas full-time young first degree has increased substantially. So you could argue that the diversity of provision has actually declined during this period. That's the backdrop to the work that I'm doing now, which flows from legislation which was passed in 2017. The vision of reform during the 5 years prior to this had always included assumptions about changing the regulatory basis of higher education from a funding council to a regulator who could have oversight of the new money going into the system, particularly student loans. But there is increasing recognition, I think, by 2017 and just before that, that the measures I described in 2011, better information for students, new providers, greater competition, more access spending, had ultimately been insufficient to meet many of the public policy priorities, in particular quality and value for money for students, and equality of opportunity in relation not just to accessing higher education, but also successful participation once there. And that's really the basis for establishing the OFS as a regulator with functions, as you can see on the left-hand side here, designed to deliver the goals set out in its general duties, those public policy goals I've been talking about. As the government takes this bill through Parliament in 2016, there is a very small majority in the House of Commons, and indeed a lot of ex-academics and vice-chancellors in the House of Lords, and there's substantial debate about the strength of access regulation, which is to be merged into the new body. And I've shown here the then minister's response to that, which is in many ways consistent with the language and trajectory we've been talking about so far. Higher education is vital for social mobility, and widening access for disadvantaged students should be central to the new regulator's approach. OFS starts work at the beginning of 2018, and it lays before Parliament a regulatory framework that in many ways reflects the vision of our first chair, Michael Barber, who had run the Prime Minister's delivery unit in England and published a lot on how to improve public policy outcomes. And the reforms we made to access and participation at that point, the regulation, were very much in that spirit. So looking at how we could actually make progress in relation to outcomes, reducing inequality across all stages of the student life cycle, not just regulate inputs such as spending, and not just focus on access to higher education alone. At the heart of that is a rethinking of equality of opportunity, the duty set out for us in the Act, and the identification of merit, which of course has been crucial to the language around higher education expansion, recognising that fair equality of opportunity requires everyone to have a realistic chance of achieving the goal, and the strength of the relationship between social background, school attainment, and university admissions in England makes that really challenging. Also, that equality of opportunity at one stage of education is worth little if there are barriers at the next. And with that in mind, we have negotiated quite significant commitments from universities to shift the dial on access and indeed student success over the coming years. And you can see that to a certain extent in some of the latest offer-making patterns. That really brings us up to today and this week, which is actually quite an important week for the current government's policies and legislation in relation to what you might call post-compulsory education. So as we enter the 2020s, the consequences of increasing higher education participation are subject to new levels of scrutiny. And some of that is, of course, due to what some have called populism, or the revolt against liberalism on both sides of the Atlantic, through which people who are not graduates, often living in communities based on blue-collar jobs, have demonstrated their power through the ballot box. Drawing on Michael Young's work after the war, writers from quite different perspectives, Michael Sandel and Daniel Markovits in the US, David Goodhart and Selena Todd in England, have shown how the pursuit of equality of opportunity, social mobility, and ultimately meritocracy by expanding higher education has diminished the prospects and standing of people who don't go to university, polarizing graduates and non-graduates, knowledge and skills, cities and towns. In England, the current government's majority is built on a promise to level up the opportunities in different parts of the UK, particularly between towns of the post-industrial North and Midlands, where there are the least graduates, and London and the South East, where are the most. And that's, for me, become a sharper issue during the lockdown and the coronavirus pandemic, which has hit the poorest communities and people hardest, both in terms of their health and their children's education. Whilst graduates appear to have been sheltered due to the flexibility of their knowledge and their skills and their working patterns, there's been really serious problems in the poorest communities. As you can see here from the current Prime Minister's speech in September of last year, there is now less focus on achieving social mobility by helping more disadvantaged young people into university, and more on what you might call social justice by improving the prospects for everyone, whatever their pathway post-18. More people will be encouraged to take higher technical qualifications below degree level, designed with employers, or to study whilst they're in work or later in life, and more to go directly from further education into jobs, crucially where they've grown up and where they live. In support of this, and this is all being announced this week, we're expecting quite radical change to the way in which post-18 studies are financed through a lifelong learning entitlement to be implemented by 2025, providing 4 years of finance for any level study at any time of life and in smaller chunks, and intended to level up the incentives between further and higher education. This is perhaps an inevitable consequences of all those patterns I've described. the continued dominance of the young full-time, full degree model, and the very low levels of higher education participation in post-industrial towns across the North Midlands and coastal towns. But if it's to work, it needs to meet the aspirations of young people and their families, the recruitment behaviours of employers, and indeed the needs of future jobs. And it needs to avoid entrenching the divisions between academic and vocational routes, which still tend to follow attainment in school and thereby social background. So that means for me that universities must be central to the vision, working with further education colleges and bridging between academic and technical and vocational education, not just the route that is discouraged. Universities need to bring their subject expertise, their relationships with businesses and public services, their global partnerships, so that students want to progress onwards to them and employers want to employ those students. That will enable everyone, when they're ready and they want it, to stretch their learning as far as they can, and that would be fair access and participation. That's it from me. Thanks, Alice. I'm happy to take any questions if there's any time, and I'll also, I think, be in the breakout room afterwards as well.
Thank you very much, Chris, for the 5-part account of decades of policy and for sharing your commentary on the trends that you've also put on the screen for us. Please feel free to unshare your screen at any point. Thank you very much. We've got a few questions that have started lining up in the chat, so I will invite colleagues in a moment to start asking their questions live. But I encourage everyone else to post your questions in the chat first so that I can see them and invite you to contribute live. And rest assured that if we don't have time to cover any of your questions now, we will move them forward into the breakout room session and we can continue the conversation there. And when you're invited to ask your question live, please unmute yourself, turn the camera on if you can, and state who you are and where you're coming from. So I'm going to start by inviting Claire to ask your question, make your comment. Claire Callender, followed by Colo.
Hi, Chris. Thank you. That was a really interesting presentation. And having lived through all those changes, I'm very, very familiar with them. So I want to, there are 2 points. You absolutely showed the dramatic fall in part-time students. And if you include those falls in overall levels of participation, what we see is that those overall levels of participation have fallen. But let's move forward, because I'm most interested in the new proposals, because I too want to see greater participation and greater diversity in that participation. However, while there are elements, as you would appreciate, that I think are very good about the proposed new lifelong learning loans, particularly that, for example, they may be available for modular learning. Some of the current restrictions may be lifted. My concerns are twofold about take-up. What we know about take-up is that, and research I have done and colleagues have done at CGHE and at UCL, is that there is some evidence that debt can be a deterrent to entry amongst those from the lowest income groups. And the sort of new programs that are going to be encouraged and developed will primarily, not exclusively, attract those sorts of students. Plus the fact all loans are based on the notion that there's a financial return to higher education. But again, research is suggesting that actually in the long term, not in the immediate short term, the financial returns to level 4 and 5 qualifications are certainly not as good compared to undergraduate degrees. So my concerns are about the thinking behind these new loans, their expansion, and whether actually they're going to be taken up by those people who need them most, given what we already know about debt aversion, and given what we know about the current loans in place for for those people at level 4 and 5 and the over 25-year-old loans, or whatever they're called. You'll know better, Chris. But that's the essence of what I'm concerned about. Not that they aren't a good idea on paper, but what will happen in reality.
Thank you, Claire. Chris, I suggest that rather than taking questions in pair, we just take them one by one.
Sure. Okay. So yeah, so quite right to flag that overall levels of participation reduce, and hopefully the slide I showed about part-time study demonstrates that. I think one of the things I was trying to say in the speech is that demand is crucial in our system. So demand has been crucial in all of those patterns I have shown. You know, whatever the policy changes, it's the demand from people of different ages and their families that has driven this. So whether or not the lifelong learning entitlement succeeds will depend on whether there is demand for it. And that would require quite a shift in perceptions around the attractive routes, whether that's sub-degree level routes or study later in life. And indeed, as you've said, Claire, capturing people who don't go at all at the moment and are encouraged to do it. I think part of the government's thinking on that would be it's looking at various ways of making level 4 and 5 provision, for example, more attractive and give it greater standing, for example, through accreditation of various means. So try to improve the attractiveness of it. I think what it also wants to do is to do some piloting. So what I showed on there was implementation from 24-25. And one of the reasons for that long timeline is it's actually hideously complicated to make this change.
Yes.
So in the meantime, I think what you'll see is announcements about piloting that will trial different models and targeting different types of students in different sectors or subject areas to see what the appetite is and what the barriers may be to inform where things go in future.
That's great, thank you. Because I'm in conversation with the DFE about the loans, you know, informal consultation. So I recognise the amazingly difficult challenges ahead. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Claire. We're moving now to Golo Henseke, and I think Golo had 2 questions. So if that's all right, Chris, we'll take them both.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for this great talk. I'm Golo. I work with CG. First, the 2 things I wanted to ask, and it's more like hearing your opinion about this, is like you mentioned the efficient sorting system or matching system, and you talked you talked briefly about that at the beginning, and I noticed that. But then afterwards, I noticed that actually it didn't pick up on, neither did policy really pick up on what can we actually do to overcome that system. What I'm aware is research that tries to, rather than overcome it, treat it as a given and trying to encourage students to make ambitious choices, i.e. to go for courses that are as tightly matched with their to have an as tight match between what you can achieve based on your entry and school attainment, A-level attainment and entry tariffs, and the requirements of the university. So rather than overcoming the system, we're looking at ways to reinforce it, to making this matching the system even more efficient. So I would like to hear from you what you think about this attempts and where we're at with this at the moment. And the second one is more general, like if we want to widen access to higher education, that's one way, but we also want to look at the outcomes. And as someone who has looked at how the diversity in graduate outcomes has increased over the last years, I'm wondering, are we looking at both ends? Are we looking at labor market outcomes as well with that? Are we expecting that by widening access, everyone will also benefit in the same way from this widening access? At the moment, it looks like that widening access plays out mostly in a way that does not benefit everybody to the same degree.
Okay, thanks. Good questions. So in terms of the policy for tackling the efficient sorting system, I mean, I would say there's probably 4 dimensions to this. So one is all the efforts that are made in schools to reduce the attainment gap between the kids from the most and least prosperous families, and obviously the Education Endowment Foundation and others have played an important role in that, although progress is exceptionally slow and most people think the lockdown has reversed it. But at a basic level, I think you'll see this government very strongly push this policy is at the start try and reduce the attainment gap in schools. But that's very difficult, as I've just said, in open societies where people like me with my own children are supporting them all the time to succeed. So that's one dimension. The second is probably dealing with perhaps the undermatching, which is shifting expectations. So it's less about aspiration, but do students think this is a realistic prospect for them if they come from the most disadvantaged backgrounds? And thinking about how the admissions system works to do all of that. And of course, there are advocates for post-qualification admissions, particularly actually students applying after they know their grades in order to shift that. We have advocated quite strongly contextual admissions, and others that are influential in this sector, like the Sutton Trust, have as well. This is short of positive discrimination or affirmative action, but it's recognizing potential. It's saying, if a student comes from a school where there's very low levels of progression in higher education, let alone the most selective universities, they've traveled a long way to get relatively high grades. And so you need to consider how you consider that context in the admissions decision. And I think you can actually see all of the highly selective universities now doing that in one form or another. And then the fourth plank is what Claire and I have just been talking about, which is where is the second chance? Regardless of what happens in the efficient sorting system first time round, are there second chance opportunities? And that's been diminishing. I think there's quite an ideological set of differences about where you focus your efforts on all of this. And I think probably governments have pushed more regulation of universities during the periods I was describing. And I've pushed policies like contextual admissions as part of this, but you may well see a move away from that at the moment, more focus on school attainment and universities engaging to raise attainment in school, and then second chances through the policies we've just been talking about. In terms of the other end of it, I think there are some quite interesting developments beyond this about how employers behave, and trying to encourage employers to recruit from a diverse pool. And there's some interesting sharing of learning between universities and employers on all of that. Having said that, we still have a very, according to Social Mobility Commission and the Sutton Trust, 25% of elite jobs go to Oxford graduates and 50% to Russell Group graduates. So we have a long way to travel in terms of shifting how employers behave in relation to this.
Thank you very much, Chris. We've got actually some other questions lined up about contextual admissions as well as undermatching. So I don't know if Johnny Rich, you feel that your question has been addressed, or would you like to ask for more detail?
Well, the question as I put it in the, hi Chris, thanks, and thanks for inviting me. My question as I put it in the chat has been answered, so thanks for that. But I'll sort of take it to the next step, which is that a couple of years ago, OFS started very explicitly to support contextual offer making far more widely and more radically contextual offer making, all of which I support along with Sutton Trust and others. But since then we've had a new universities minister, and her language has been not so supportive of contextual offers. She referred to students from disadvantaged backgrounds being missold places at university because it wouldn't bring them the social mobility that they were led to believe. My view is that you can't count the value of education entirely in through the earnings potential, especially when you need to look at the difference between what they might have earned otherwise and what they do now earn because they have a degree. But anyway, So is this still the direction of travel, or do you feel that the direction that the government is suggesting is that we don't need the other 50% to go to consider higher education? We need to make better provision for them outside higher education.
So I guess that sits at the heart of part 5 of what I was talking about, which is looking very hard at what happens to the other 50% if you frame it in those terms. And what I would argue for is this is not a binary division between higher and further academic and vocational, but thinking about what the pathways are across the two, and not setting higher education up as this thing that you just don't do, because actually if this is going to succeed, it needs higher and working together, enabling progression between the two. And I hope that's what you'll see. So it's less about not going into higher education, but perhaps less about not going young full-time, full degree straight away. And even then, I think you've got to avoid that becoming a new divide, essentially. You know, people who get the grades in school go young time, full degree, and others go through a different route. We've got to have something that's more kind of fluid than that.
Many thanks. I'm going to ask Rob Cuthbert to ask his question next, and then depending on time, I might just ask Diana and Solomon to ask their questions, and we may or may not have time to address them in full. Rob?
I think that's on
Okay.
mute.
Rob Cuthbert, please
He's speaking,
unmute your mic. Please unmute your mic.
I beg your pardon, sorry.
There we go.
Am I the first this conference to have that said to them? Chris, thank you for that talk. Terrific. And I agreed with so much of it, but I do think there's a problem with the policy narrative. Undermatching or efficient sorting, whatever you like to say, is just code for students not choosing what we tell them are the right courses to choose. And low quality courses, which is featured even in today's Queen's speech, I think, is just code for courses in the wrong universities, as far as anyone can see. And the issue is not about getting a few thousand more students into high tariff universities. It's about whether 1 million students in the higher education system are getting a good higher education, which I believe they are. But the policy narrative, and it's not just this government, it's every government policy for the last 20 years, has repeatedly said they don't. And if we really honoured student choice, we wouldn't be so obsessed with the Russell Group, is my brief version of this. And we wouldn't tell students that they're wrong to choose a different kind of university.
Yeah. So I'm very sensitive to the notion of undermatching and telling students what they're doing wrong, and we do everything we can to try to avoid that and talk about students making the right choice for them. I would say for me it's probably about both. So I don't think you can avoid, as I showed in those charts at the start, what flows through from access to the highest tariff universities, all those numbers I repeated about the proportions of elite jobs that go to certain universities. And maybe society will change over time, so that won't be the case. But in the meantime, I think it still matters who gets into those universities. So that's an element of our regulation. Equally, you're absolutely right that the majority of students aren't going to those universities. So the most important thing is that they're accessing a course that works for them, that gives them an enriching experience that leads to good prospects and fulfilling lives after all of that. So I wouldn't say it's one or the other. I think to a certain extent for me, there's a degree of both.
Thank you. And for the remaining minute, the last question, I will ask Solomon Amari Ziboldi to ask the question, and then we will continue with Diana's question in the breakout room. Solomon?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I have this argument. I think it would be a bit unethical for me to talk about, policy talking about widening access to higher education when the attainment gap is widening. Okay, across across the board, at all levels of education, from early years to higher education. Okay, and all the stats shows that. And I don't know why policy fails to demand higher education institutions that students from all backgrounds must share higher attainment. And that way, they would be forced to look at the things that they're simply complicit about: culture, structure, curriculum, diversity, staff diversity within themselves. Because a number of studies have established that higher education institutions are culturally constructed, for middle and upper class, predominantly white students. Okay, but we have studies, confirming to this fact for many years. So why are we not having a policy that demands this and that puts on? And this is not new. For example, this happened for gender. Okay, that is tied to funding, and institutions who do not meet, that improvement progression in gender parity, their funding would be affected. The same can be done about closing the attainment gap and demand institutions that they must ensure that students from all backgrounds must share higher attainment. Why is that a big problem?
Thank you very much. Chris, I realize that the time has run out, so if you'd like to maybe start towards an answer, and we can continue in the breakout room afterwards.
That's fine. So I mean, I'm assuming when we refer to attainment here, Solomon, you're talking across all levels of education, but including the attainment gap in higher education, which is, crucially, 22 points between black and white students in undergraduate education in England, and more than half of that even once you discount entry grades. That is a really serious issue. And I think there are patterns in our system where progress on diversity at one level leads to new frontiers at the next. So you can see that with women, for example, at the very top of academic careers. You can see it with disabled students in relation to their experiences, and you can see it with the attainment gap among undergraduate students, where actually you're more likely to go into education if you're a black student than a white student, but then much less likely to get a first or a 2-1. We have made that part of our regulatory activity. So not just looking at access, also looking at continuation and degree outcomes. And so virtually all universities across the country now, as part of their plans, have set out measures they're going to take to try to address that. And we watch with interest to see whether it succeeds.
Thank you, and I'm afraid that this is all I've had time for in this session. Thank you everyone for your questions, and many thanks to you, Chris, for the keynote and for engaging with those questions in the discussion. We'll now move to the breakout room, and I saved the questions that were asked and in the chat, but we've not been able to ask them live as well, and they will be addressed if people are also present there in the breakout room. The link is in the chat so that you can join that session, and to join you'll need to log off this meeting and use the new link. So thank you again, Chris. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you in the breakout room in a minute.
Thank you.